So I want to start with the poem that his first poem that he published under the name Lewis Carroll, Solitude, to set the scene of his interest in children. The last lines are, "To be once more a little child for one bright summer day." This is 10 years before he's writing the similar thought in Alice in Wonderland. As I want to explore this period of time between this poem and the development of the story. Alice's Adventures Underground. We're all familiar with this book. The presentation copy had the dedication to her whose namesake one happy summer day inspired this story. This is a rather puzzling statement because he's very precise with words, and namesake doesn't mean her, it means somebody with her name. So the question is, what was he referring to when he was dedicating the book to Alice Little's namesake? Did he really mean her, or did he mean some other Alice? But it has to be somebody with the same name. So this is the illustration at the end of the book. You've probably seen it. I'm sorry, but the quality of the graphics aren't perfect in several of these slides. But this is his drawing. In fact, by the time he'd presented it to her, he'd covered it with a photograph, so that we can tell from this exactly what he thought Alice looked like and what she actually did look like. So comparing these two, you see this drawing a very accurate depiction of Alice, and she has short, dark hair. But I neglected to point out that in his own illustration of Alice listening to falling asleep, listening to the story, she has long, blonder hair, maybe not very blonde, but red was very popular at the time. So we can see this contrast more completely in his drawing of her and many of the drawings from the book that we've been hearing about today, his own illustrations. And clearly, there's a very consistent theme of the kind of hair that she has. It's not dark, it's medium, strawberry blonde in some cases, and shoulder length or longer. So this is a very different person that and it may relate to the dedication to the namesake. Now, as many of you know, it's been proposed by Geoffrey Stern that the inspiration was a Pre-Raphaelite painting of the model Annie Miller by, in fact, Holman Hunt, and the relationship of that to the hair in this particular illustration of Alice cooped up in the little house. So many people think open and shut case, that must be his source of inspiration. But let's not jump to conclusions too quickly, because many Pre-Raphaelite paintings of women at exactly that period had very similar thick hair, and of course this is the thickest hair in the book that he's picked off to make the comparison. So again, contrasting all those Pre-Raphaelite women with Lewis Carroll's illustrations. So, but how in fact did he know the Pre-Raphaelites? I hadn't realized this. I wrote a book about some of these sources, and it's not in the book, but Lewis Carroll, or Charles Dodgson, met the Pre-Raphaelites in 1857, and the event was the painting of the building of the Oxford Union. Now, I don't know if you know about the Oxford Union, but it is the source of most of the prime ministers of Britain since that time. It's the debating society, and almost every prime minister of Britain turns out to have been the president of the Oxford Union at that time in Oxford. It's a rather narrow club. And this is the building, and it's decorated by paintings by the Pre-Raphaelites. And the story is that when it was built in 1857, the Union existed before that, but this debating hall was built John Ruskin suggested to Dante Gabriel Rossetti that he should invite his painter, himself and his painter compatriots, to come and paint the bare walls of the Oxford Union. And so these are the paintings that they painted from all the way from William Morris, Rossetti, Edward Burne-Jones, Arthur Hughes, and some other people that you may not be, I was not familiar with, let's say. So this is Rossetti's contribution. It has this Arthurian theme. They were all related to the Arthurian theme. In fact, ironically, Rossetti didn't finish his painting, and you can see this clearly from his sketch, which also is unfinished. And part of the problem was the lighting conditions and something about the paints. It wasn't coming out very satisfactorily, and apparently you can barely see these paintings. They're still there, but you can barely see them. However, a large group of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood did come to Oxford in 1857, and Charles Dodgson had recently joined the Union. 5 months earlier, he'd just become a member, so he was interested, involved in the debating, you can well imagine, and he has well-established connections with the Pre-Raphaelites. He would go to London and photograph them in their studios. This is Dodgson's photograph of Dante Gabriel Rossetti, Christina Rossetti, and other family members. So this gives us an immediate link. And in fact, so now we have an array, I'm not going to go through all this, of the muses of these artists for him to, he would have interacted with. He would be visiting the studios, he would know these women, and he would see how inspired the painters were by these women. So let's look at some examples. Christina Rossetti, Carroll is known to have given a signed copy of the book to Christina Rossetti, so he had a specific relationship with her. And here's Dante Gabriel Rossetti's first painting of Christina in the Annunciation. And I'm going to do some completely fictitious juxtapositions of possible relationships that you might see. You say, well, if Carroll had seen that painting, could it have rested in his mind and had an influence on how he did the drawings? So these are some examples. This is Hamlet and Ophelia. Ophelia's crying. So here's a juxtaposition. Here's the cooped up in the little house, this possible relationship with this Lady of Shalott. This is the cover illustration of Christina's book of poems done by her husband, possible relationship and so on. Another of the famous muses was Elizabeth Siddle, who also married Dante Gabriel Rossetti. This is Lewis Carroll's photograph of him again. This is how she looked. It seems to me this could be as much a relationship. This is some other versions. Here's the water carrier, or the golden water. She's carrying, I'm just picking off possible parallels. This rather long-necked painting of Elizabeth Siddle, rather reminiscent, I think. But these ladies were at advanced years for the time, for models of the time. Let me not overstress that, but Annie Miller was 27, Christina Rossetti was 32, Elizabeth Siddle was 33. In fact, she died that year. All far too old to be of interest to the Lewis Carroll that wrote that poem, seems to me. So another possibility is paintings by Arthur Hughes. Arthur Hughes was the one that he connected with most closely when they visited Oxford. This is his photograph of Arthur Hughes and of his daughter, Amy Hughes. And this painting he commissioned by Arthur Hughes and had hanging over his fireplace his whole life. So this could well have had an influence on his illustrations. And so I'm picking off an example where he uses the same head tilt as her name is Tryphena Ford. Here's in front of it by a tree. Here's on a horseback with a tilted head. Here's George MacDonald was the one that really enthused him for writing children's stories. So there's a possible relationship here. And a final one. Oh, sorry. The one rather extremely appealing painting to me that I've actually seen, so that could match up with his illustration of Alice drying out. But none of them was named Alice, so they don't fit in with the story of the namesake. So what Alices do we have to pick from amongst this group? Well, one of them was Alice Gray, daughter of, sister, that's a mistake, sister of Effie Gray, who married John Ruskin, who was the tutor of Alice Liddell, and who then married Millais the painter. This is Lewis Carroll, Dodgson's painting of, Dodgson's photograph of Millais and of his family. And so this is Effie Gray, who is another, could equally be a candidate for this illustration, as the origin of this illustration, just as much as Annie Miller. But we needed somebody called Alice. So this is Alice. I couldn't find a tight identification. This appears to be Alice Gray, her younger sister. And here's another painting which is definitely identified as Alice and Sophie Gray at young age, 11 and 13. So here's Alice Gray compared with one of Dodgson's illustrations. Here's another portrait of Alice Gray by Millais. And here's a third rather very appealing portrait that relates, interestingly, to a poem, She's All My Fancy Painted Her, etc., about an Alice Gray. This was earlier, so it can't have been the same Alice Gray, but it was the poem that Lewis Carroll parodied, She's All My Fancy Painted Him, in a poem that he published 10 years again before the book. And so this is my pick for the illustration that looks like Alice Gray. However, there's another, Ellen Terry. She was an actress. She's the only one of these women that he writes about in his diary. He writes, I especially admired the acting of little Mamilius, Ellen Terry, a beautiful little creature who played with remarkable ease and spirit in The Winter's Tale in 1856. We're lucky to have a photograph of this. This is Ellen Terry with her little cart in The Winter's Tale. This is Ellen Terry on a mushroom. The next year, Ellen Terry as Puck. I've covered that over. This is in Midsummer Night's Dream. Quite a nice connection there. This is slightly older Ellen Terry. It's actually in Bristol, but I'm linking it to another drawing from the book. This is Ellen Terry as a knight. Ellen Terry then married this painter, George Frederick Watts, who was a Pre-Raphaelite, at the time that Lewis Carroll seemed to be interested in her. And he painted, the marriage only lasted a year, but he painted several portraits of Ellen Terry in this period. This is Ellen Terry with her sister Kate, relating it to the sisters. This is another portrait, and this is the choosing, and it's an interesting choice because it turns out Ellen Terry's first name was in fact Alice. We don't know if Lewis Carroll Dodgson knew that her first name was Alice, but it was Alice, so she's a possible Alice. And in fact, he followed her not only when she was 9, but all through her life, and he did this acrostic. So he did puzzles, as for many women, but for Ellen Terry, when she was 30 or something, she's the answer to this poem acrostic, this acrostic poem. And this is Lewis Carroll's own photograph of Ellen Terry when she was 16, when she was just marrying George Frederick Watts. And there's a quote from Hudson about what his sister thought. "We cannot say with any certainty that he ever fell in love in the adult sense, although we know that his sister believed that he was in love with the famous actress Ellen Terry when she was about 17." And this is his photograph of Ellen Terry when she was 17. So I'm not claiming to have the answer to this puzzle, this mystery, but here's some thoughts of possible relationships and possible relationships that we can exclude because they don't fit all the facts. And some of my some of these ideas and some of my other ideas are in this book I published last year, Parallel Alices. Alice Through the Looking Glass of Eleanor of Aquitaine, which looks at the history, the medieval history underlying all the Alice books that is not covered, I think, in any other book. So thank you very much.